Thanks for your questions, everybody. We're back here on Gather to Grow. Now, in the interest of time, I won't spend too much time with introductions like I usually do. Lisa was giving us an introduction of who she is and what she does within the agricultural space. Over to you, Lisa. Thank you so much.
So I'm actually an attorney by profession, specifically specializing in intellectual property, which covers things like trademarks and copyright. And how that interplays with the agricultural space specifically is I also do quite a lot of advising on advertisements. So those that would fall under what we call the ARB, the Advertising Regulatory Board, as well as various regulatory aspects, including those that fall under the Agricultural Products and Standards Act, as well as those that fall under the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act. And obviously that's how it interplays with what we're discussing this evening, being labeling and advertising of foodstuffs and the new regulations that have come out.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And then we have Craig Merrill, who's also from Agri Enterprises, Head of Advisory Services. Craig, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Dawn. Thanks for having me here. So I'm responsible for a couple of things in Agri Enterprises, but what we're looking out for is we maintain the best interest of smallholder and emerging farmers with multiple of our interventions. And I think it's really important that we provide access and provide platforms to get this kind of information into the hands of smallholder farmers and emerging farmers who are wanting to do the right thing and maybe don't know how. Maybe they're looking to get the chili sauce one day into a larger retail store. So I'm hoping that this platform and the information from this platform can be useful to them.
Thank you so much, Craig, and we hope that too. Actually, it was inspired by an article, obviously, that you were featured on Food from Zanzi that my colleague Octavia actually wrote, and she's in the space too. So thank you so much for your contribution to that. And that's definitely what we hope to achieve tonight, is for people to get more information about these regulations and also the changes that are being made. And of course, we can't talk about the food labeling rules and regulations without kind of giving this broader overview, sort of understanding what it's about without highlighting these draft regulations. So maybe, Lisa, you can kick us off with what the latest is, what people should know about, and what they should be aware of.
More than happy to kick us off. Perhaps let's just start with what the current position is. So currently, all foodstuffs in the country are regulated by what we call R146, which is the labeling and advertising of foodstuff regulations. Those were last officially updated in 2012. There was a draft that came out in about 2015, 2016, but there was a number of issues with it, and following objections by various parties, they never came to be. So allowing, basically, there was a recognition that we should be coming more in line with the position in other jurisdictions, specifically like the position in Europe, as well as really, it seems to me to be a push and a drive from our government departments, and specifically DAF, being the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, to ensure that there is sufficient information provided on labeling to persons so that the consumer at the end of the day is able to obtain the required information, as well as ensuring that there isn't what we call misleading statements and claims being made on products. And also that there is this very sort of fine line between what is considered health products, what is considered medicines, and what is considered a foodstuff, and trying to essentially clarify those lines. Whether these regulations do that or not, that's another question. But the current position then is that in terms of what's out there in draft and for comment purposes, there was a first version being the R2986 that was published on 31 January. And interested persons had until the end of April to submit comments. However, there were issues with that particular draft. There were some problems, and what has subsequently happened is a second version has been published. That's R3337, was published on the 21st of April 2023, and there's now an opportunity until 21 July to submit comments or any concerns with regards to these regulations. In addition to the regulations, it's very important to note that there's a series of guidelines which initially weren't published but have now since been published. If I'm not mistaken, 13 or 14 guidelines that also try to direct and assist people with what information should and should not be on the labeling and even in the advertising of foodstuffs. I can say at this point as well, though, what has happened is we've gone from quite a sort of simple, not simple, but I mean not so lengthy document, which is the previous regulation, current regulation R146, which was about 50 pages with 45 pages of guidelines, to the proposed regulations, the second version, being 245 pages with the guidelines consisting of 109 pages. So there is a considerable amount of information that has been put into these regulations now, and I must say it's quite a mission, I think, for the average person to wade through this and to make sense of what exactly is and isn't required. I don't know if you want me to keep going and start with sort of highlighting specific aspects, or if you are happy with the lay of the land for now.
I think obviously a lot has changed now this past month, and what you're saying is obviously very vital. And I'm hoping that we can maybe break it down maybe at another session so that we can actually go through this. Because, I mean, an important aspect is who comments, who can comment, and then maybe just understanding what is the thing that affects farmers or agro processors. I mean, I guess all parts will affect them. But what should they understand would probably be a key question for me from my side at least. Maybe Craig and Siobhan, maybe you guys can share some of your insights. If you've read the now 200 and something page document already, what should they know?
A quick little take on food labeling is it's a little bit like paying tax. You don't get anything for doing it right, but the moment you do it wrong, you face really heavy penalties and you can get in a lot of trouble. Maybe a quick take is that the responsibility for labeling any consumer goods pretty much belongs at the point of sale to the customer or to the consumer. So if you're the person directly selling anything that's packaged or labeled to consumers, then the responsibility rests with you to do so correctly. But if you're a wholesaler, then your customers whom you sell to and then they resell, they have the responsibility to label correctly. However, because packaging is a value chain process, your customers will pass their requirements onto you, which you have to follow very closely. So if there's any failure or any break in the chain anywhere, it'll be very much past the blame to find where the fault occurred.
There's definitely that aspect of traceability that is vital for farmers and agro processors so that we can kind of map it along the way. I think you've answered my next question in part with, food labeling requirements, who does it apply to, and is there any difference between locally produced food items or products compared to imported products? Siobhan or Lisa, you can take with us now?
I don't know if Siobhan's got something specific to say, but I can jump in here. The regulations, the draft versions specifically state, Regulation 2 sub 1, that it applies to products which are manufactured here, imported, sold, advertised. So it's everything, whether you're importing or whether you're producing it here, whether you're donating or even just offering for sale, all of that is covered. And all of that must be compliant with the labeling regulations.
Yes, I agree with Lisa. And I have a question for Lisa maybe, but I tried to read in terms of asking what should farmers know. I think it also applies to what industry they're working in. I think we'll get to it later about like the type of wording that they can use, but dairy farmers and poultry farmers should specifically look at the things that are influencing, let's say, their packaging as well.
Definitely. Lisa, any comments on that?
Yes, absolutely. There are specific. So I can say up front that, let's say, a dairy farmer that is now producing milk that's going to land up in a store, not only do you need to take into account these labeling regulations, because there's certain terms, for example, that you cannot use. I'll get to those. But in addition to that, there are also specific regulations that are issued under the Agricultural Standards and Products Act. And I know that there are specifically ones for dairy. For example, there's specifically ones for eggs, whether you can call it a free-range egg or a barn-raised egg or caged egg. There's specifics about that as well. Malted barley has got specific regulations. Meat products do. Fruit has got specific regulations, as well as maize meal. And then there's also an additional lot of regulations relating to fortified products. So if you are producing a product that you fortified because you're required to under the foodstuffs, there's also separate regulations under that. So not only, unfortunately, is it required that you look at the labeling, but you also look at these additional regulations for the industry specific within agriculture to make sure that you comply with both. And I think it would probably be best if we kind of did them each on a separate basis. And I don't think we'll have time tonight to go through each lot separately. What I could rather do for you is the broad strokes from the food labeling regulations that are specifically relevant. Unless you want me to sort of deal with anything else specific at this point, I can really kind of sort of very broad strokes highlight what really is essential, shall I say.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think there's room for us to maybe have another conversation based on the changes, but also, the different industries that we can have as a part 2 of this conversation. When I first drafted these questions, I think I might have looked at the previous copy and some of the comments that were made on this draft regulations that prohibits, for example, a package or label or advert or foods, carrying a front and pack labeling. depicting or anything that contains a reference to any celebrities, sports stars, cartoon characters, computer animations. I mean, that for me was already a biggie. So I'm not sure what else has been added to this long list that Lisa's now spoken about. But how will that change the game for people who are labeling and processors and ultimately people who sell the products, but also us as consumers? I mean, that's very different. If you just think about how my son gets attracted to these things, and I don't know, it will change the game completely. But what is your take on that?
Maybe just before I get into the front of pack labeling, just sort of, I think, important aspects I do want to just mention is, one, what these regulations cover is what information must be on a label. Number two, when can you make certain claims? And those are relevant to the nutrient profiling of what the product contains and what the nutrients are in it. When can you make health and nutrient claims, if at all? What are considered misleading claims? And then when you fall under this sort of nutrient claims, that's where we start talking about these front of pack labeling. So what has happened is they've now come up with these provisions where you are required to put front of pack labeling, and I'll explain what those are, these massive big logos that are required onto products which are either high in saturated fat, sugar, sodium, or any artificial sweetener. So it doesn't matter the quantity of artificial sweetener. The moment it contains artificial sweetener, it must contain this front of pack label. So there are provisions in the regulations as to what that quantity is. So it's whatever percentage of fat versus what the actual total composition of the product is. And when you fall within that, should I say, you exceed that threshold, then you're required to put this labeling on the front of packaging. And it's now going to mean, and I can say this, it's 25% of the packaging that must be covered with these logos. So it's a triangle is the one that you're required to put on with a big exclamation mark in it, which is supposed to be a warning to consumers that there's something about this product that's potentially, in essence, not healthy. And then further, whether it's high in sugar and then it'll have, I think it's like a teaspoon basically to indicate that it's high in sugar, or is it high in fat, or is it high in sodium? So there's the 4 different ones that are required to put on, as is applicable or not. There's even specifics about what shape the packaging is. Is it a cylindrical object? Is it a square flat packaging? And therefore, how big these labels need to be on it. In addition to that, it also requires that it needs to be a white background with black writing on it that these labels appear on. So the scenario which we envisaging is, for example, certain of our breakfast cereals. Those are, I think, the ones where I tend to be quite guilty on the sugar content. You're going to have, and it's also if it's over 12,000 square millimeters, 25% of that packaging is now going to have these big logos on the side. It also must be tagged to the top right-hand corner of the packaging. Going to have these big things on it. And it's to the point that, 25%, that's a quarter of your packaging is now going to have this on. So it's not much space left for the rest of the depictions and names of the product, or, the rest of the descriptions that you potentially want to put on there. And then when is it applicable in terms of the marketing? So the part that you've spoken about with regards to not using celebrities, cartoon characters, puppets, computer animation, or what similar strategy is what they refer to. They've clarified in the second version of these regulations that that's only going to be restrictive on marketing to children, and children have been defined as being persons under the age of 18. So it does mean, it's going to have a massive impact. You mentioned, your child and them choosing, again, a breakfast cereal. We're not going to see a tiger on certain packaging. We're not going to see the squirrel anymore. The orange fellow that appears on the orange squash, we shouldn't see him anymore. Chips, there's some famous characters there as well, whether it's a depiction of a ghost or it's a depiction of a round chippy man. Confectionery products, there's a lot of those kinds of products that we are not going to be seeing these cartoon-like characters anymore, whether it's on the packaging itself or in any marketing, because generally speaking, those kinds of products are being aimed at children.
This is really crazy. I didn't think that this was such a big game changer. I don't know, even as a consumer and someone who's in the industry, it's very interesting. Siobhan, Craig, what is your take on all of this? Craig?
Maybe another aspect to bring in as well is we mustn't forget about origin of products as well. So no matter what we're importing, it has to be in full compliance with our regulations, even the draft regulations now. We expect them to still change a bit once public comment's done. But it's important to maybe just highlight imports, for example. When importing food products, we make a delineation between, are you a single composition food product or are you a compounded product? Like single component food, take for example grapes. With grapes, you have to list exactly where the country of origin is. There's no ambiguity to it. You have to say, okay, I'm importing, say, Egyptian or Israeli grapes or whatever the case. You can't get away from it. But when you're not importing a single composition food, there's actually a little bit of wiggle room that you're still allowed and you're still afforded. You've almost got 4 categories that you have to disclose, and you can choose any combination of these 4. So you can talk about where the food was manufactured or where some of the main components were sourced or where it was packaged or where it is eventually sold. So if you are, like, take, for example, chocolate bars, we never really know exactly where our chocolate bars are made, and the new regulations, the draft regulations, still don't address this exactly.
Thanks, Greg. Siobhan, and then I have a question from one of our listeners.
Oh, okay, on the previous one. Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of the companies are stressing about this because if you think about it, it's quite a competitive industry, potato chips, cold drinks. And for children, much younger children that choose these products, they can't always read. So it would be interesting to see how much they actually rely on these logos, the colors, and the animations, and how different are the chips really packet X next to packet Y. So it would be interesting to see how much marketing actually does play a role. And I think companies are really stressing about this, the new proposals.
Thanks, Siobhan. And I think a follow-up conversation is definitely needed where we can maybe get some of those industry players in the room as well, talk about, what they think as this process continues on. We have a question here from one of our listeners saying, okay, what about the informal sector? What do these regulations mean? For example, a poultry farmer who not only farms but also processes on how his farm processes chickens into packaged products and then sells it locally or in the community. So in the informal sector, agripreneurs don't necessarily include nutritional information on their labels. So what happens to that sector? How closely will it be monitored? What happens in terms of the informal market? Lisa, Craig?
I'm sure Craig might have closer insight as well, but interestingly enough, these draft regulations also included a definition of the term street vendor. So you're talking about informal sector, well, it even talks about street vendors, although it does later on specifically exclude street vendors from having to being subject to these regulations on certain fronts. So like, for example, providing all of the necessary information, nutritional information as well on packaging. It also talks about catering establishments. So for example, if you as the poultry farmer, you have a farm stall on your premises and you are now also providing hamburgers for sale, chicken burgers for sale with your product, it actually speaks to the fact that those places are also now subject to the regulations. So for example, if you were, technically speaking, selling a hamburger, a chicken burger that is got quite a high fat content, perhaps you're deep frying it, putting a lot of sodium in, you're actually supposed to also have, when you provide the customer with the product, in that little, burger box, you're supposed to have these, what we call front of pack labels on them. So it applies to the catering establishments as well. That's a bit scary and far reaching, especially for those in the informal sector. As to whether there's going to be enforcement in the informal sector, that does remain to be seen. I know they tend to, at least from a department perspective, focus on your retailers first. So you might be aware that not so long ago, last year in fact, there were some products that were being threatened to be removed from shelves where they are what we call meat analogs, or rather, the veggie burgers and the veggie sausages, where there was issue taken with the use of the word burger for something that's not a meat product, or use of the word sausage or banger for a product that only has a plant-based origin content. So there we saw actually what's happened is there was actually a court challenge, and there's been an interim interdict that's been obtained, stopping the department from removing the products from the shelves. But we have seen the department trying to sort of flex their muscles as such and actually ensure there's compliance. Again, I think it'll be in the retail sector first and not so much in the informal sector. But that doesn't mean that it does not apply to those in the informal sector, unfortunately.
Thanks, Lisa. Craig?
So just a quick one. Lisa, I love that you brought up the fact that there is the definition street vendor, and we just need to bear in mind that these are draft regulations. So, it can potentially change, especially once public comment is closed and we find all the, the exceptions and everyone's had their say. But generally, so reading further on in about talking exemptions, the wording in an older version, which has already changed, the street vendors are exempt from labeling requirements. But now we need to understand who's defined as a street vendor. So an older version already says a street vendor means a person who offers goods or services for sale to the public without having a permanently built structure, but with a temporary static structure or mobile stall or with their goods laid out on the sidewalk. By this definition, the moment somebody has anything that resembles permanent structure, they're not exempt and they have to be in full compliance with the law. And that's what Lisa mentioned. It's now the question of where does enforcement and where does compliance get checked up on. So it's important to start doing it, but also to be cognizant of what the law says.
Just on that point, what are the timelines in terms of these new draft regulations and how long is public comment for? And just so that we can also map the process from our side. And then again, I just want to bring it home to our sector, of course, focused on the agricultural sector. And then maybe just to reiterate, what the current rules are that need to be followed. But then more specifically, just, what we should be taking note of as farmers in the agricultural community. Everyone?
If I have it correct, that comments are available until the 21st of July. In terms of how long it would take after the comments, or that they can't take any comments or any suggestions anymore, maybe Lisa has more of an idea on how that process works. But I think the biggest advice I would give to farmers is to know your industry and to look at what's specific to your industry. Like Lisa said, it can be quite a long document, very overwhelming to a reader that doesn't work with this day to day. And I would just suggest having a look at your industry or commodity first.
Thanks, Siobhan. Lisa?
Tagging on from that, that's correct. The current time period is open until the 21st of July for parties, any interested persons. So that's important to note, whether you are the individual that wants to submit comments, whether you're a big entity being a manufacturer of prepackaged goods, or if you are a farmer, you are entitled to submit comments, and that's until the 21st of July. Then with regards to the implementation, it's specifically stated at the end of the current regulations that it'll be implemented, and let me double check this, if it's 12 months or 24 months. But it should be 24 months, with the exceptions, though, that there are certain regulations that come into play immediately the moment that these regulations are signed. So what happens is after this draft process and commentary is given, then it normally goes back to your National Council of Provinces and then to Parliament, basically to vote on whether it should be signed into law or not. And then from there, once it's actually been signed by the minister, does it only come into effect and into law. So I don't expect that we're going to see this being implemented, let's say, so it's not like on 21 July, immediately, suddenly this is going to be enforced. That's not the case at all. But I do also think unless there is massive comment and pushback, which, as Craig mentioned, I think there is, and there is going to be because some of the consequences are far-reaching, that you could be looking at it within the next 6 months to a year, perhaps potentially actually coming into force. So regulations enter into force 24 months after the date of publication. That is with the exception of certain trademarks that are affected by these regulations, where people who have actually gone and registered a trademark, for example, which potentially has a misleading aspect to it or contains a word that you're not allowed to, for example, be it fresh, be it wholesome, be it nutritious. Oh, because you're not even allowed, if under these regs, you're not allowed to use the words nutraceutical. You're not allowed to use smart. If you have anything that has a trademark like that in it, it's effective immediately, unless it was registered before 1 May 1995, in which case the people have 6 months within which to stop use of it. So we're going to be seeing, especially on sort of the bigger retail front or bigger manufacturer front, you may actually see some products completely being removed from the market and some well-known marks that you are accustomed to seeing on shelves actually not appear anymore.
Wow, this sounds like a lot, like that 200 and something page document that one would need to go through. So, I mean, this is obviously one platform that we've now created for people to access this information and find out more and consult. But what do I now as a farmer do? I'm a new and developing farmer. Maybe I'm even on a commercial level already. My brand is out there. People are familiar with it. What are the cost implications and what are some of these other implications that I now have to take note of today so that I can be aware of how it's going to impact me? I just want to bring it home in that way. And then if we have time to maybe go over some of those other compulsories when it comes to labeling and why we do it, Maybe we can focus on poultry for one. That's what I wanted to also ask, if we have time. Thanks.
I'll maybe kick us off towards the end of just saying there's 4 really big change areas that I would take note of if I was a farmer, especially if I was a emerging or smallholder farmer. Irrespective of how well established the brand is, you can do a lot more damage to your brand by not adhering to upcoming regulations. And you have an opportunity now to get ahead of the curve and to plan out your branding and your marketing strategy. But also, these aren't here to make it difficult to sell your produce. These aren't here to make it difficult to do business. They're here to protect you and I as consumers. We all have to buy food at the end of the day to some degree. So it's here to protect us. I mean, there's, interestingly, South Africa's still got one of the highest obesity rates in the world because of multiple factors. But one of them is we're not easily and readily available. We can't get all of our information readily and easily available enough. So we have to make sure that the packaging makes sense and is even more accessible to consumers. So I mentioned 4 really big change areas if you're looking at packaging your produce. I just sum it up as saying nutritional claims, health claims, misleading descriptions, and then the last one is just food categories. So with nutritional claims, that's talking about front of box packaging, warning labels. You're going to have to put those on if you are labeling your produce. Lisa mentioned in quite a lot of detail about that. Health claims saying healthy, smart. Health claims, you make sure that it's backed by fact, backed by science. Don't just put it there because it sounds good. Misleading descriptions, these are things that have to be linked to a protocol. You can't call something healthy, you can't call something organic, you can't call something grass-fed or hand-reared or free-range unless it's linked to a specific protocol. Those protocols are registered with DALRRD, and you need to make sure that your product is registered in that protocol. And the last one is food categories. You can't use an existing category's name to market your product that your product does not fit into that category. The example is like vegan sausages or no meat patties. You can't call something a vegan sausage because sausages are derived from meat. You can't call something a no meat patty because, well, there's no meat in the patty. So I think there's a clear effort to try and delineate animal-based products versus plant-based products. And that's also for the benefit of consumers. If people really don't want to eat meat-based products, let it be easy for them to see that there's no meat in this. This is not an animal-based product.
Thanks, Greg. And then while you were talking, I was just thinking about what about stuff like honey, other medicinal plants and crops that gets processed, like moringa? What happens for that? All these indigenous crops and foods, how does that work?
I'm sure Craig's also got an answer, but I'm going to jump in quickly. That's part of the reason why it's gotten so lengthy in these regulations. But it does talk about certain culinary herbs that are now considered to be foodstuffs, very clearly foodstuffs, versus things that are now not allowed to be considered as a foodstuff anymore. So take, for example, anything that's got a ginseng or ginkgo biloba or anything like that in it. The moment it's got that in it, it actually falls to a complementary medicine. And it's now going to be regulated by the Medicines Act as opposed to being a foodstuff. So the requirements are different. Things like, something to just point out, whole grain. There's a whole plethora of specific requirements with regards to when you can say whole grain, not whole grain, whether it's a recombined whole grain and what the percentage is of the hulled wheat versus the husk that's in there. So if you're in that space, specifically from an agricultural perspective, just to please, get familiar with that. I was having a debate with somebody earlier today with regards to what do you do about a chamomile tea, for example, or even a lavender tea, where you potentially claiming it has an effect. And now you are restricted on what you can say that tea does for the person. So if it's going to have a calming effect, if it's going to help you sleep, you're not allowed to actually say that anymore. Or if it's something that helps your digestive system, technically that's now a health claim. So, be careful about that. I think also something to keep in mind, especially when it comes to agricultural products, is that there are guidelines specifically about when you can use the words fresh, natural, pure, traditional, original, authentic, real, and genuine, when you can call it homemade, when you can call it farmhouse, what you can call as a farmhouse pate, or when you can say something is premium, finest, quality, and best. So the big ones really being natural, pure, traditional, and original.
Just to add a last comment, or to add on to what Lisa and Craig are saying, not everything is changing. There are terms that you can still use, like free range or anything that can be linked to a specific protocol, which can be approved or registered with the Department of Agriculture. And like they mentioned earlier, superfood, what does that mean? It doesn't really have a true definition when it comes to food. or it's hard to define. So not everything is changing. There are still a list of terms that can be used.
So it's not all out. I mean, we can adjust to this. I mean, it may take us some time. And I think it's important that we kind of also just highlight that. So for farmers to kind of know that this is the boundary that they can now play in. And I'd really love to have all of you back and maybe get some more other speakers in the room as well. I'd love to hear from the farmers in base. You know, what are you guys thinking? How are you guys feeling? Lisa, over to you.
One thing I do want to also just point out, it's always been a requirement, but it's just become a little bit more specific, is with regards to the use by dates or best before dates, as we know them, or expiry dates. So there's now a reference to use by dates required, best quality before date. So you need both of that. Or there needs to be a date of manufacturer or a date of packaging. So obviously, if you are a farmer who farms with potatoes, you're a potato farmer, and you are now basically providing them in this pocket of potatoes, obviously you're not going to have a use by date on it, but you do at least need to indicate the date on which the product was packaged. And that needs to be in a manner that it's actually well attached to the packaging so that it cannot be separated from the packaging at any point in time. So, and that applies across the board, whether that's an item of fruit or anything of that nature, just to indicate to the consumer when it was packaged. And importation, you should not be importing stuff unless there is more than 12 months left on that use by date or best quality before date. That was just an aspect I wanted to bring up that people must just not forget. And then just back to what Siobhan was saying, that it's not a case of you are completely prohibited. It's rather a case of, so some words are completely prohibited. There we go. Other words, like, for example, fresh, it's a case of when can you use it. So they're wanting fresh to rather be used in the sense of an indication of time at which something was picked. So, for example, freshly made this morning or freshly squeezed, they're not so keen on. In the guidelines, it sets out exactly when you can and cannot say that sort of thing. It really is when you're thinking about how to promote your product out there, that when you're going to use these kinds of terms, that you just think about if there's any aspect of any misleading that could happen and to guard against that and make sure that you use the term in a way that isn't going to be misleading.
Thanks, Lisa. Craig, maybe I would like to get your insights just to kind of get a feel of what you've encountered farmers, sharing with you in terms of these new draft regulations and how they're responding to it specifically. Maybe you can give us some insight from your side. Thanks.
So look, it's really important to be compliant with any regulations with the moment you start seeking access to more or increasingly formal routes of market. Completely informal marketing routes, the labeling requirements, they apply, but it's probably not as relevant. However, if anybody's looking to expand your business, if you're looking to do business on a larger scale, you need relevant accreditations. I mean, everyone refers to the golden standard of agricultural practice, which is GAP, Good Agricultural Practices. So GAP accreditation means that you're going to have to label your stuff anyway. So if you're wanting to market your food through any formal means, you're going to have to be compliant with the regulations anyway.
Thanks, Craig. The farmers that I've known for a while, Ludwe Majiza, thank you so much for joining us and for contributing. What's your take? What are you feeling? Any questions or comments from your side? Thanks. Also, just an introduction of who you are.
Hi, good evening to everyone. Sorry, I joined a bit late, but I do want to say that I'm out in the Eastern Cape in a rural environment, but I do supply to Boxer stores and a whole lot of other farmers, Spar, and to the market right in our area. This is where everyone else gets the produce from. Some of the retailers actually go to the market. Some of the stores go to the market. And I'd like to know, will this be enforced at the fresh produce markets as well? Because those are the guys who actually we send our food to mostly, and they further distribute it. I don't see any checks being done. So I'd like to know with this new thing coming up, because it's going to close a lot of doors for farmers in rural environments, because it's a bit challenging to implement some of these. Just like to know if this will be implemented all across everywhere, even the fresh produce market.
Yeah, thanks, Ludwig. Lisa, maybe you'll come in if I miss anything, but my quick take is that the FPMs are not the consumers. FPMs buy wholesale and they later resell. They, in fact, repackage and then resell. So specifically deliveries to FPMs, I believe the information should have to be available, but it's not packaged. That's the thing. Like the food is put into boxes, and on the exterior of those boxes, there's labeling, but it's often not even cling wrapped because at FPMs, they know the food's going to be repackaged. So the packaging is actually minimal there. Did you pick up anything specifically about food being delivered to fresh produce markets and the draft regulations?
There is, I just wanted to check. There are exemptions, I think, as you mentioned before. And one of the exemptions to the labeling requirements, the following foodstuffs are specifically exempt. And those are eggs, except for the date on which the eggs were packed, fresh unprocessed vegetables, fresh unprocessed fruit. So there's your answer, no. Oh, and even unprocessed meat of animals and birds, that's also not included. Unprocessed fish, marine products, meat of animals and birds. And then any ready-to-consume foodstuffs prepared and sold on the premises of a catering establishment for consumption, including wheat products which are not prepackaged. So naked bread, for example, like, if you, again, I'm thinking the farm stall environment, except for information on the list of ingredients, common allergens, and date of manufacturing printed on the scale label and kept on file and made available immediately upon request.
Thanks, Lisa. I hope that answers your question, Ludwig. If you have any other comments, do let us know. I think there's definitely room for us to have another conversation, perhaps once the process comes closer to closing, once we have some more comments from the public. I'd like to also get some suggestions from anyone who would like me to invite specific people. I'm always open to, getting as many voices in the room to share their diverse opinions when it comes to our topics that we cover here on Gather to Grow. I'd like to thank all of my speakers for joining us, and maybe just like to give them, final minute to even less to share their final closing comments, and then we'll wrap up the session. I'm going to start with Siobhan. Thanks, Siobhan.
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, we definitely need to have a follow-up chat. I'm learning a lot in this discussion as well. But I think the takeaway message is this is to protect consumers, to make it easy to understand. And at the end of the day, it's going to be difficult to implement because change is always scary. But I think if we all work together, then it will be a good thing.
Thanks, Siobhan. Craig, your comments?
I'm really looking forward to all the plant-based new labels and food categories that we're going to see coming up, because you can't use the word milk or meat to describe your product anymore, so you have to come up with a new label. So I'm really looking forward to all these new food categories that are going to be coming up.
Yeah, no, definitely. I see farmers innovating on another level. I'm looking forward to going shopping over the next few months and seeing how it will change. Maybe I should start buying up my favorite brands and keeping it just for keep's sake. I don't know if that's a thing.
Sell them in 5 years' time to the collectors.
Exactly. Lisa, your final comment?
My final comment is really just, and that really probably comes from the space that I work in, and that is just, if you plan and prepare yourself and you following these guidelines, you can actually provide the required information to consumers that then makes you not only compliant, but I think actually puts you in a place where the consumer is able to readily absorb your product because they understand what it is that you're actually selling to them. So planning in my world is very important. And that goes from what you call your product, how you categorize it, and what information you provide on the labeling. So if you plan, you'll be okay. And if you're uncertain at any point in time, then, do reach out, seek a space. There are spaces that you can ask these kinds of questions. And also if it is industry specific, so that we can consider it further.
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate it. And of course, Food from Mzansi will also keep you updated on the latest. We'll have an article based on this conversation being published on Food from Mzansi. And also, I'm committing myself to hosting at least another session on this topic and keeping you guys, aware of what's happening and what the changes are. And hopefully we get to have more engagement from farmers and consumers as well, because we're consumers ourselves. I mean, I'm just processing all of this and seeing how it will change even the way I purchase goods in the future. Thank you once again to all of my speakers. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with me. I'm looking forward to our next engagement. All the best with farming, everything that you're doing within the agricultural industry. Just keep on farming and thriving and doing what you do best. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And from my side,